Good morning and welcome to the very first MIDI live chat channel. Today we're going to be talking about MPE, and we have a great panel assembled here today. My name is Adam Bilius. I'm the Director of Strategic Product Planning for Yamaha. We have Ben Supper from Lilley. We have Gert Bevan from Moog Music, who's done a lot of work with MPE for a number of companies, Pat Scandalis from Mo Forte, and Roger Lynn. So, Roger, if you don't mind, I think it'd be great if you have an MPE device in front of you, and if you could, I'm going to switch over to you, and maybe you could play a little bit and explain a little bit about what MPE is.
Sure. Thanks for attending, all who are attending. What MPE is the ability to have primarily polyphonic pitch bends on an expressive instrument like an instrument or Rolly Seaboard or Hawken Continuum or the new wave of these instruments. So if you only play a keyboard or an expressive control over a single channel, you can't do polyphonic pitch bends like this. But with MPE, you can. So you can do things like a violinist would do double stops or triple stops. So that was 3 pitch bends at once. And the way it does this is actually very simple. It just sends each touch over a separate MIDI channel. And this is something that actually has existed all the way since MIDI 1.0 in 1984, which was necessary for guitar synthesizers so that each string would have a separate pitch bend. But what we're doing, and which is very nice, is basically sort of making it official for synthesizers now. But there are already about 75 or more synthesizers that are effectively MPE compatible because they just send each note over a separate MIDI channel. And so it's really wonderful because it allows you to do much more. Another example of that would be if I play a pedal steel guitar sound, I can hold one note in pitch and then slide another one. There's a lot of examples in other types of music. So I'm very, very pleased that it's now a standard, and therefore it will be official, and there will be lots of MPE synths and more and more as time goes on, MPE instruments like an instrument.
That's great. I'm going to ask Ben Supper. Ben, I'm going to put you on screen there. Yeah, Ben, you work for Lilley, and Lilley was very instrumental in bringing MPE to the MMA. And
Yes.
making sure that it was an official standard. You want to talk a little bit about that whole process?
Okay, well, Lilley really started with the instrument, the Seaboard, which, if you don't know what it is a reimagining of the piano, but instead of keys, there's a big silicon surface, and that allows more expressive potential because you can do, as Roger Lynn demonstrated there, pitch bends just by sliding a finger, or on a Seaboard you can do vibrato by wiggling a finger. And so you have all of these things where polyphonic pitch bend is necessary, where being able to swell in decay notes just by adjusting pressure of fingers on keys becomes a possibility. We dug ourselves a bit of a hole with this. Being an innovative instrument around at an early stage in the world of innovative instruments, we found out what other people like Hawken found out, which is that although these features are part of the MIDI specification, there aren't many makers of synths, either hardware or software, who really take this kind of stuff seriously. If there's nobody really using these use cases and the features don't find themselves in the product. So having dug ourselves a hole, we found out that we had to roll our own synths to make this stuff work. We tried a few solutions and ended up bringing this simple as possible technology to the MMA, which other people were by that time also working on informally with us, and saying, we need to get this working. We need to build an ecosystem, or people just aren't going to be confident enough to buy these new products. So in trying to build a community of developers who are taking this stuff seriously, we found that working with a MIDI Manufacturers Association was the most likely pathway to to getting this stuff into the public domain.
That's great. So, Garrett Bevan, you work for Moog Music, but you actually did work for a number of different companies.
Hello. Yeah, I'm not sure if you can see me. So I've worked a lot with Roger on instruments, which was sort of at the same time period as Lilley was working on their C-boards. And before that, I joined a company called Eigenharp for a while, who is still making instruments called the Eigenharp, who ran in exactly the same problem that Ben was describing, and that was sort of exacerbated by the fact that it was sending out a whole bunch of very high-speed MIDI data that then had to be interpreted by some kind of synthesizer because it had no built-in sound engine at all. And at the time, computers were actually really struggling with that data. So we went in a similar direction where we built this whole like host application that had to run on all operating systems and that had its own built-in synthesizer inspired off of modular synthesizers. And then we tried to bake in support for audio units and VSTs, and ran into the problem that no one actually was aware of or didn't want to put in the effort of supporting per string, like Roger said, that per string expression over MIDI channels, and felt that the need for a spec like MPE was really important. And so it seems that everyone over the last few years has gravitated to that same realization, and now we're here, which is kind of amazing.
Yeah, I think it's hard for some people to understand exactly how much work creating a MIDI spec takes. I know that Garrett and Ben and Pat Skandalis, who I'm going to turn it over to next, there was a tremendous amount of work to make sure that the specification was easy to implement and had all of the things to make sure that it was, the thing about MIDI is interoperability. We always, whenever we add something new, we always have to think about exactly how it is going to affect all of the MIDI devices that are out there. So I'm going to turn it over to Pat Skandalis. Pat works for Mo-Forte.
So my name is Pat Skandalis, and I'm the CTO of a company called Mo-Forte that makes a musical instrument product that's based for iOS devices on physical modeling of strings. And so MPE is a great, powerful thing in expressing this particular product. It's called GeoShred. And we've been working on these models for a long time, for about 30 years, and we always struggled with the problem of how do you control these models. We used to use guitar controllers, way back in the 90s. And so we got involved with the MPE group because here was a solution for a problem that we've been trying to solve for a long, long time. We've been looking for these good controllers to map to the expressive gestures that physical models offer. So I want to just show you a quick video here of what's possible. This is actually our product running on an iPhone, and it's doing the full MPE spec using 3D Touch on the phone to implement the pressure or Z direction. So that's very interesting because you can see what's possible to do with MPE. I wanted to mention one final thing. We did a whole talk about MPE at Stanford Karma about 2 months ago, and I can share the link to that talk for folks. And one of the most interesting things to me is that there's a whole new generation of instrument makers there in the academic community. Students are coming up who want to make interesting multidimensional controllers, and they were tremendously interested in MPE. Because it creates an opportunity for them to control things in a way that they've never been able to control. That's it. Thanks.
Okay. I noticed that we actually have some guests. And one of the things that we can do with this platform is we can actually invite people who are listeners to join the panel. About, it must have been maybe a year ago, maybe a little longer, Berklee College of Music had a Voltage Connect conference. And at that conference, there was an MPE panel. Roger was on the panel. I was on the panel. And there was a gentleman in the audience who asked some very interesting questions. So we're getting ready to actually ask him to join the panel and to ask some questions of the panelists. His name is Chris Lilley. Chris is an engineer who's building his own MPE device. And his day job is that he works for the W3C. So, Lawrence, do you think you'd be able to add Chris to the panel for a second? We're trying out some new technology here. Chris, you are live.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes, we can. Excellent. Yeah, I had a few questions. The first one that I had for the panel was about testing. Does it help for me to paste in the question, or do you have the one I sent in from email?
Yeah, I have.
I've pasted
Yeah,
it
there
in.
it is. Yep,
That's easy.
perfect.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm interested in testing and what the pass criteria are, because MIDI is a little bit, it's very open-ended. You can either do something or not do something, and so expressing what the correct result is for a given test seems challenging. But I'm sure it can be done. It's just you probably require a range of different things, all of which are correct. I wondered if the panelists had any thoughts on that.
I can talk about that.
That's Pat, right?
No, that's Garrett.
That's Chris. That's Garrett.
But I'd like to add something at the end afterwards.
Yeah, and Chris, I'm going to actually put you into a mode where you're going to have to. I'm going to put you into a mode where you're going to have to press the microphone button to speak because we're getting a lot of echo. So I think that should have solved the problem. Go ahead, Garrett.
So I'm sharing a little window on my screen here. So Chris, what I've started to work on like almost just a week ago or something, because I realized the same thing is there's two problems for a lot of developers. Is many of them don't own an MPE controller but are working on synthesizers, and vice versa. Working on an MPE controller, but might be wondering what the accepted collection of messages are, and if they're actually using the spec correctly. So the first thing that I started working on is part of two open source tools that I released last year that heavily leverage Juice. And what they basically allow you to do is, as a developer, to send and receive any standard MIDI message on the command line. And so as a first pass, what I did here was I've got a tool called Send MIDI that has a new command called MPE test. This is really just a prototype that I wrote in maybe an hour. And then another tool here, this is the second tool that I make, Receive MIDI, that will list all, so it receives all the MIDI commands, and then it will send that over to an iPad that is connected over Bluetooth. So what this will do is Send MIDI will go currently in a very simple test scenario that does polyphonic pitch bends and polyphonic timbre control. You'll see the MIDI messages appear, and you'll hopefully hear the sound on the iPad. So I'm going to kick this off. Doesn't seem to work because probably the iPad is connected in the meantime. Just give me a second. Oh no, because I forgot to start this tool. I'm really sorry. It's like the demo gods are always doing something weird. Let me just quickly check if the iPad is still connected. It is connected. Okay, let's do this again. Hopefully it's going to work. So what this did was set up the pitch bend sensitivity, starts a major triad, bends the pitch bend in opposite directions for the different notes, and then does independent timbre control. So the plan with this tool is to build this out to a whole series of other scenarios that we can extend over time. And then going hand in hand, I plan to do the opposite in the receive MIDI tool. So the one that is running here, which would also have an MPE test command, where if you send it MIDI information, it will analyze what it receives and gives you like warnings or error messages based on what is considered valid or not. So that's that.
And Pat, maybe you can talk a little bit. I thought you had developed some checklists. We talked about maybe sharing those with people.
Yeah, that's correct. Let me see if I can share the screen here. So our product is both an MPE receiver and an MPE sender, and so we get approached all the time by various different controller makers to say, hey, we want to make our controller work with your product, and we also have to be able to control lots of different synths out there, because we have a lot of people interested in controlling various different synths. So we've developed I'll call it a semi-qualitative set of checklists. There's checklists for senders and checklists for receivers. And I'll tell you, quite frankly, from a pragmatic perspective, the number one challenge in getting MPE senders, receivers talking to each other is pitch bend range. And Garrett just brought that up a moment ago as well. And there's an RPN which is used to set up the pitch bend range. And once the pitch bend range is correctly set between the sender and the receiver, usually at that point, things go pretty well. So this checklist here, I just shared it in the text section of the window, and this is what we're using currently. So I've gotten approached by a couple different manufacturers of exotic controllers here in the San Francisco Bay Area, and we're working with them right now, and I'm pretty much working off this checklist to give them feedback about how their controllers perform as far as an MPE controller is concerned. Thanks.
Yeah, that's great. So somebody posted, I've had a few issues with CC74 commands, e.g. straight from the instrument to several hardware synths, where CC74 control is usually defaulted to modulation commands in mod matrices. MIDI CI, one of the things that we are planning to do is to make a profile out of MPE. And so the profile would actually specify, and in the future, you would be able to take care of all of those issues of how the CCs were assigned by having a profile that specified exactly what they would be assigned to. So I would encourage anybody who's interested in MPE to also go on MIDI.org and take a look at the MIDI capabilities inquiry. There are three parts to it. One, it allows to negotiate to a new protocol, which the MMA is working very hard on. It allows profiles, and it also allows property exchange, which is the ability to query a MIDI device in profiles, and property exchange work with MIDI 1.0 devices if they have enabled the capability. And you would be able to property exchange allows you to query a hardware device for its patch list. You can view that patch list and its categories. And so there are a lot of things going on with MIDI, and MPE is a part of that. So does anybody else have any other questions? I think we've done a pretty good job of covering the basics of MPE. And if you do have a question, please post it to the chat list at the bottom. Chris also had some questions about 7-bit and 14-bit. And one of the things that we might want to talk about is not just 7-bit and 14-bit, but I think that some people have experience on the need to actually thin data. And so does anybody want to jump into that challenging topic?
I'd like to jump in on the 7-bit versus 14-bit discussion for just a moment.
Right.
And,
yep, go for
and
it.
also just a quick note on the pitch bend sync. RPN 0 is really helpful for making sure that the sender and the receiver are synchronized. And that, quite honestly, has been the biggest challenge in getting our product to work with other products. And the default is good, it's 48, but I think, always sending RPN 0 is a good idea as well, and always responding to it. So the 7-bit, 14-bit thing, we get asked about this all the time. It's, humans are really, really good at discerning, pitch, doing pitch detection. And certainly for musical frequencies, it pretty much has to be 14-bit. And And so we're very lucky in that the MPE spec is using pitch bend, which is a 14-bit controller. So for pitch bends, for X movement, we're getting really good musical frequencies. The other controls are 7 bits, and I know that can be disappointing in some cases, but the thing that we have found is that staircasing and zippering, the root cause of both of those things is not only the fact that it's a 7-bit controller, but it's also because the MIDI controls are quantized in time. They're temporally quantized. And so for everything on the DSP side, at least in our world, and other synthesizers that I've worked on, whenever a control rate stream comes in, which is a low numerical resolution, 7 bits, and a low temporal resolution, no more than 1 message every 44 samples for 44.1, we have a low order filter that is converting the control stream from the MIDI rate to the audio rate, and that low order filter is also doing smoothing. And so in many cases you can simply work around the 7-bit resolution using a low order filter on the receiving side of your signal processing. And then the other thing is, like, for instance, for sliders, sometimes sliders are very tiny on the screen, and for some of the sliders in our product, there's only really 5 bits of resolution there because there's just not enough pixels there to get much resolution. And so again, using a low order filter on the DSP side to convert the low resolution control stream into an audio control stream is really the strategy to go. That's all I had to say.
Yeah, well, and that was a good bit. The other thing that I think is important to note, that the MMA is working on a new protocol. Some people like to call it MIDI 2.0. All of the protocol proposals that are currently under discussion and actually they are very close to being finalized. People are starting to prototype with these new protocols. All of the control change messages are 32-bit. And the other thing that we will be working on in the future is, one of the issues that we have found is that we did some research. Certainly when you're sending via USB to a computer, there's no problem because USB is very, very fast. The problem comes in the fact that when a computer doesn't necessarily know what's on the final endpoint of sending out from the computer. So it's sending out via USB, but the end device that is receiving it could be a 5-pin DIN MIDI device. So what some software does throttle the speed of USB back down to MIDI 1.0 speeds. So how do we fix that? There are some things that we are working on that will be improvements to the way USB 1.0 drivers work with. And if we have a new protocol, then we will need new USB MIDI drivers to support the higher protocol. So those two things will probably happen at the same time. So yeah, just to let you know, we are involved in working on those problems inside of the MMA. We encourage everybody, and I think, Chris, I know you have some thoughts also on the openness with which the MMA works. If you're there, you just have to press on the button if you want to speak, or actually I can just turn you on if you like.
Can I still say something about the 14-bit thing?
Absolutely.
So I think Chris, that we reached out over Twitter at one point, didn't we?
We did, yeah.
Yeah. So I really appreciated, by the way, the effort you went through to compare the final spec with the draft spec or an earlier version of the spec. I think that was really helpful for
that was
people.
Great.
Yeah, it was a very good initiative. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for doing that. And so for other people listening in, at one point we were considering adding in 14-bit support and making it a requirement for all the sound sourcers to support it. But given how long it has taken for sound sourcers and controllers to even adopt MIDI guitar messages that have been around for so long, we thought it was important to be as focused as possible and to really go at this problem by one step at a time. So pick the most important battles. And in this case, properly handling per channel expression and formalizing that in an extremely simple, to the point spec was the real focus. And as Ethan says, there's other specs that are right around the corner that will push MIDI into the next millennia. So trying to solve something that is almost there, and at the risk of reducing the adoption rate of MPE, felt like it was too big of a risk to take.
I agree, and I think that was probably the right decision. I was just a bit disappointed personally. The hardware
Me too.
It has actually the 14-bit DACs on it, and 16-bit for pitch.
Yeah, Chris, do you want to talk a little bit about, and I think it would be interesting because we had this conversation with some of the panelists before we got started. Your question that you sent in via email was whether having the initial specification that was done by a group of people and put up on the internet so people could, look at it, was that a help or a hindrance in developing the spec? And I think, unfortunately, the answer is pretty complicated, and it's probably a little bit of both.
It might be. I mean, I have a very strong opinion on that, but I'm sure that there are counter arguments.
Yeah, and so just so you know, one of the challenges that we had is because the specification was out there, people went ahead and they built MPE products. And one of the MPE products that was on the market, it couldn't do a firmware. It was incapable of doing a firmware update. And so we were put in the position of having to make some compromises in the specification because we didn't want to put that company at a disadvantage, because all of a sudden we could have completely broken their product and it wouldn't work with anything. So it was really a balancing act. Garrett, maybe you want to talk a little bit about that, because I think you were involved in a couple of different projects at the same time, doing firmware for a bunch of different companies. Do you remember any of those conversations? Because I do.
I remember a few of them. I think in general, this was a positive thing, certainly because there had been so much talk about it, and having something to start working from so that people could see that there was actual effort being put behind MPE, I think catalyzed quite a few of the efforts, which then in turn validated the importance of MPE and started creating a real interest from the music community, which was already there when the final spec came out. So instead of having that ramp up afterwards, having it there when the final spec is released, I think is actually pretty powerful, because it allows people to emotionally try things out when they see it being announced and being talked about, which in essence MPE is just a technical thing on a piece of paper. If they can try it out, it's even more powerful. But what I personally felt was that maybe a better way could have been to periodically update that spec, or at least write down short summaries of what was going on, because at one point it felt to a lot of the people that were talking to me about this that nothing was happening anymore. They thought that we were sitting there twiddling our thumbs, not working on the spec, while we were actually working very hard. So maybe there was a little bit of a disconnect, and that would also, I think, avoid scenario that you explained, Ethan. If people see that there's a sort of continuous stream of changes, they might not, decide to create products that are fixed in a certain, a certain version of the specification, because they see that things are changing.
Yeah, I'd just like to address it. One of the things that we try to do on the MIDI.org website is to cover the history of MIDI. And the history of MIDI, especially at the very beginning, is actually very fascinating. And it comes to this kind of struggle between companies who want to build MIDI products and end users who also want to have input into the specification. If you go back and look at the history of MIDI, in the very early stages, everybody kind of has this, thought that, Mr. Kakahashi from Roland plugged a Jupiter 6 into Dave Smith's sequential circuits products, and MIDI was just happened. The reality is that there was about 2 years where it was very unclear who was controlling the MIDI specification. And at that time, there was the International MIDI Association, and it was a group of people who were trying to represent end users, and they had a very open attitude towards putting the specifications out and letting people comment on it. Manufacturers, on the other hand, said that could create an awful lot of chaos. And so we are always kind of in this battle between chaos and structure. And so I know, Chris works for W3C, and I know how W3C works, and it is an open standards organization. One of the things that we are trying to do with the MIDI Association, and I think that this webinar is a great example, is to be more open and to create avenues for people who are not members of the MIDI Manufacturers Association to engage directly with the people who are in the MMA, express their opinions, and make sure that their opinions are heard. We did this with MPE, and at that time, when the MPE spec was being developed, we didn't have all of the capabilities that we do have now in the MIDI Association. I think that we will want to do much the same thing for the new specifications like MIDI CI. And as we are further developing those, that we will need to do these kind of webinars to engage people at different levels, end users, developers, people who have an interest in MIDI but aren't necessarily members of the MMA. The difference is, and it's very simple, if you want to participate in the MMA and you want to have a say in the MIDI specifications, it's pretty simple. You join the MMA, and it's not particularly expensive to do that. It's based on revenue. The larger companies pay much, much more, and small companies, the minimum dues rate for the MMA is $500 a year, which is not particularly expensive and also gets you a SysX ID. But having said that, we understand that, somebody who's maybe making an iPad application, that's a lot of money if you're not making a lot of money off of MIDI, which is why we want to have these opportunities to have direct interface between MMA companies and the people who are writing the specification and the people who are going to have to use it. Does that make sense to everybody? Any comments on that, Chris? I want to make sure your opinion is heard.
It helps, certainly. I don't think it's sufficient. I think it helps to bring out intermediate drafts to let people see what's happening. And it also helps if there's a change log so people can see what's changed since they last looked. And having some sort of feedback in GitHub, whatever. In W3C, we've moved to that sort of model where all of our specs are available all the time. But we also have the situation which you mentioned earlier of we pick one spec and they implement it, and then we're stuck. And that's happened to the browsers multiple times. And eventually they have to come around and update. And basically, it's good to have constant comment and people, early adopters, but that means they also have to take a certain amount of risk and plan for that risk and be ready to update. I mean, I was very sad to hear about someone who did an implementation with no update capability, but seriously, why?
Yeah, that's one of the problems we have with MIDI. We have no ability to enforce good design. And so, one of the great things about MIDI is that it's eminently hackable. People do all sorts of crazy stuff with it, which is what makes MIDI great. So again, we always try to balance off those two things, the freedom of access to the information, but also trying to be protective, because the one thing about MIDI that is incredibly important is interoperability. It still amazes me that we had this new specification for property exchange. And one of the people in the MMA took that, and they have a device. It was a Florian Bohm from Bohm Software. He made a translator so that a Yamaha DX7, which was one of the first devices to have any kind of MIDI implementation, he wrote a translator so that it would be compatible with this new spec, and you could pull the patches out of a DX7 with their names via MIDI 1.0 and make it compatible with property exchange, this thing that was done 37 years later. It is still an amazing thing that MIDI has all that interoperability and millions of devices on the planet. So we have to take all of those things into account. Tom White, who's the president of the MMA, is on the panel. Tom, did you want to weigh in on any of the MMA's policies?
The only thing I would add maybe to that discussion is that Chris makes a good point that most stuff today, even hardware, is really software running on a microprocessor, and it should be relatively simple to just update something. So perhaps part of the reason that we don't take that approach is just historically. We've been around for over 30 years, and years ago that was not the most common way things were done. So we didn't take that approach. We typically, someone wouldn't build a product at all until a spec was done. Yes, that is now changing, but then again, the example that you gave with MPE was a classic one. There was a major device that couldn't be updated. So I think that we certainly understand that the way of the world is the W3C way, and you should publicize drafts as they go along, get as much feedback as you can. It's not just W3C, ISO, IEC, they all work the same way. It's just a little bit challenging for MMA to do that at this time because we have a history. We still have companies making embedded products that don't have firmware updates. So
yeah,
it's not a
Which was the product that didn't do firmware updates?
I don't know that we want to publicize that.
Oh, it wasn't me. You're not talking about Linstrom, right?
No.
Okay,
No.
good. Because there was a problem with Linstrom that it didn't accept sysx, but it does do firmware updates.
Right. Yeah, no, it was somebody else. I thought that Chris had a good point, and it's something that the MMA can take a look at. In particular, I think if we're, and this is just, I will say this is my personal opinion. It doesn't express the opinion of the executive board. It is my personal opinion, but I know that this opinion is shared by some other members of the executive board. I think in particular with something as major as MIDI 2.0, that we would want to try to get as much feedback and as much prototyping as possible before we make final decisions. So if we're at the point where we're at a feature freeze, where we feel that we have something that is at the point where all of the features are in there and now people are starting to actually work on prototyping, which is, I believe, pretty much where we are at this point.
Ethan, that just makes me think of something that I would like to highlight for the people that are listening in. One of the powerful initiatives that we did, Pat was there also, was at NAMM before that the spec was actually released. I think it was not this NAMM, but the year before. We took time out and had like a room set aside for us where people that were working on devices that supported MPE, both as controllers or sound sources or both, that we actually had a little connectivity session where we tried them all out and saw how they behaved, exchanged best practices. And I thought that was really powerful. And maybe building around that particular effort could be something that would be interesting to people that are looking into specs that are being developed or that are being researched.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there are all sorts of ways that it can be done. And I think also, for example, having to sign an NDA so that they were provided with the specification, but they didn't publish it on the internet, but it was available to a wider group of people. There are things, but all of those would need to be they would need to be decided by the Technical Standards Board of the MMA. Probably not even the executive board, but the TSB.
I think it's important to point out too, though, that it's not just the MMA. There's a separate organization in Japan that handles MIDI for the Japanese market and for all the Japanese companies, and we have to work hand in hand with them. So this is one of the other challenges: is that when we talk about things that MMA is doing, just because we decided that this is a spec does not mean that it's been signed off by that group yet. So. And vice versa. Sometimes they submit stuff to us that they've approved, and then we have to approve it. So it makes it challenging to say publicly, this is where we're at, because it may not be where we as an entire industry are at.
Yeah, I will point out, since I work for Yamaha, that the new protocol that we are working on was an initiative that was started by Yamaha and has the support of AME. So we are in a position where both the MMA and AME are very close to having a new protocol that has a lot of capabilities. So I do encourage everybody, if you're interested in that. Right now, the quickest way to get access to that specification is to join the MMA. And I think we also need to look as an organization at how we deal all that stuff. I can hear Roger in the background going, I really would rather just be playing music.
I'm sorry about that.
No, that's okay. Actually, I think that we're about ready. Roger, do you want to play us out?
Sure.
Do you want? Yeah. I'm gonna put. Go ahead. I'm gonna put you on the screen if it's okay.
Yeah, one thing I guess I would like to say, I don't know how many of the people in the audience are techie or more musicians. So I don't know how savvy you are about some of the tech stuff. But I want to say one thing. There have been expressive instruments about all around with one channel for years, like the Akai Iwi or the Steiner Parker, before that, after that, rather, the became the Iwi, or the wonderful Yamaha WX5 controller. And they're monophonic instruments, so they have no need for MPE. And so you can still do expressive synthesis and performance with an expressive controller. But for example, here's a simple synthesis sound on the instrument where I'm getting polyphonic pressure, because polyphonic pressure has been around since MIDI 1.0. And I've still got 3 dimensions of control for solo lines. But if I'm holding one note while I slide another, then the instrument is smart enough to know you can't do that because there's only one pitch bend on a channel. So it steps that note. And that's actually done by some wonderful software that Garrett wrote, who's the main programmer of the instrument. So I'm not trying to confuse things, but I'm just trying to say that I've noticed with a lot of people that write in about an instrument that there's confusion. People think you need MPE to do expression, but you don't. You need MPE to do polyphonic expression. That's all. But
no, that's a great point.
It's also important to note that by the MMA creating the spec and the MIDI Association creating the spec, a lot of people don't know the distinction. So if it just gets to the MMA, then it does it all, which really helps us all. And it's been difficult for me because for the past 3 years, a lot of synth makers have been waiting for a spec before they add polyphonic expression to their synths. And unlike Rolly, I don't have my own built-in synth in the instrument. So it's great that it's out now. Then there is clarity, and because of conferences like this and the press about MPE, it's really helping to get people familiar with it and get people to build that into their synths. So I will play you out, and to do that, I will play the same sound I had hooked up, and I'll just do this. In this case, I'll go to MPE mode. That's it. Thank you.
That is awesome. So I just want to make sure that there were a couple of questions, and I'm going to address them. And there are, of course, always the tough questions. Is the MIDI board going to break into the developer's office of Ableton and tell them to get with the program regarding passing through MPE? The good news is that we have a new member on the executive board of the MMA, and it is Friedemann Schultz from Ableton. And so he, although of course I can't say what another company is working on, I can say that Ableton is very interested in all of the new specifications that the MMA is working on, and they are now an official member of the MMA, which I think is great. We need the input from the new, speaking for a company that's been in business for over 100 years, we need those new forward-thinking companies like Rowley and Ableton to be a part of the MIDI Association. So we really welcome companies like Rowley and Ableton into the MMA. I'm looking over here and trying to see if I've missed any things. I will say that I'm going to take one of the questions, which is about the Korg N5. I have your email address, and so I think what I'll do is I'll take that offline and see if I can get you some recommendations. One thing I would like to point out about MPE, which is really cool, and I think you're going to see this more coming in the future. The people from audio modeling that I know Roger loves their instruments, very expressive physical modeled instruments. They have developed some new software called Camelot, and what it will do is it will take any 16 channel multi-timbral instrument, and using the Camelot software, it will turn it into an MPE compatible receiver. So it's a very smart design, and so it allows you to take something like a Yamaha Montage, or you could take your Korg N5 and you would be able to get the Camelot software, and it has a mode where you can enable it into MPE. It copies.
Uh-oh, we lost Ethan.
Yep, seems we did.
Well, I will say one thing about Camelot is that it will cram a lot of new capabilities into MIDI.
Okay, that's a mic drop. So I think we should end it there. I want to thank all of the members of the panel: Roger, Gerrit, Ben, Pat, Tom. Thank you so much for joining. Thanks to all of the people who participated from the listener side, and thanks for everybody for joining. And like to give a special thanks to Lawrence, who is on the MIDI advisory, the MIDI Association Advisory Board, for providing us with the Horn platform to be able to do this. This is the very first one that we did. Hopefully everybody felt that it went pretty well. I think it was really, really cool. And we can start to do more of these as we get new specifications coming.
Thanks, everyone.
So, thanks, everyone. I think we're gonna. I'm gonna hit the button and we're gonna stop broadcasting. But Roger's playing us out.